What if a tiny 21-mile-wide bit of water could bring the global economy to its knees? That's not a question from a disaster movie. It's the reality of the Strait of Hormuz, the artery pumping about a fifth of the world's entire oil supply. And if Iran ever decides to turn off that tap, the domino effect doesn't just spark a global crisis. It hits your local gas station hard. The final price you could end up paying isn't a wild guess or speculation. It's a mathematical chain reaction, a cascade of dominoes, all but guaranteed to fall. In this video, we'll walk through that sequence, showing you exactly how one nation closing a single choke point can trigger a global bidding war for energy, a war that could end with you paying over $10 a gallon at the pump. This is the anatomy of a crisis, and it all starts right here. Before we can get the collapse, you have to appreciate this system. You could argue that the Strait of Hormuz is the single most important choke point on the planet. It's a narrow channel that separates Iran and Oman, linking the oil giants of the Persian Gulf to the open ocean and the rest of the world. Every day, nearly 20 million barrels of crude oil and other petroleum products squeeze through this strait. To put that in perspective, that's about 20% of all the petroleum the world consumes, flowing through a channel that's just 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. The world's biggest oil tankers, some longer than aircraft carriers, navigate these crowded shipping lanes in a constant, delicate dance. The countries that depend on this strait for their exports are a who's who of energy superpowers: Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, Iraq, and Qatar. But the nations on the receiving end are just as important. The huge economies of Asia, China, Japan, South Korea, and India are incredibly dependent on these shipments. For example, while about 7% of U.S. crude oil imports passed through Hormuz in the first half of 2025, that number is astronomically higher for Asia's biggest economies. And it's not just oil. About 20% of the world's liquefied natural gas, or LNG, mostly from Qatar, makes the very same journey. That's the fuel that heats homes and powers factories across Europe and Asia. So this strait isn't just an oil route. It's a total energy lifeline. For decades, the global economy has been built on one simple assumption: this lifeline will always stay open. The price of everything, from your morning coffee to a cross-country flight, is quietly banking on the safe passage of ships through this waterway. But what happens when that assumption is proven catastrophically wrong? A crisis here probably wouldn't start with a formal declaration of war. It would likely begin with something far more insidious: risk. A soft closure can be just as damaging as a military blockade. Picture this. Iran's military doesn't need to sink a whole fleet. It just needs to make a credible threat. It warns that any ship in the strait is a potential target. Maybe it lays a few sea mines or uses drones to harass a couple of tankers. Instantly, the math changes for every shipping company on Earth. The strait is no longer a safe highway. It's a potential death trap. The first immediate result is a traffic jam. Within hours of a serious threat, tanker traffic could plummet by over 90%. Ships worth hundreds of millions of dollars, carrying cargo worth even more, will drop anchor and refuse to enter. At the same time, the global insurance market would panic. The firms that underwrite these massive voyages, like Lloyd's of London, would either refuse to offer coverage or jack up their war risk premiums by an insane amount. We're talking about an overnight jump of 5,000% or more. That's millions of dollars in extra cost for a single trip, if you can even get insurance at all. And that's the first domino. It's not a military blockade, but a commercial one. The Strait of Hormuz becomes effectively closed, not because it's physically blocked, but because it's become economically suicidal to use. With 20% of the world's daily oil supply suddenly stuck, the second domino starts to wobble. the price of oil. Almost immediately, commodity traders from New York to Singapore would react. With millions of barrels a day gone from the market, the price of Brent crude, the global benchmark, would explode. We've seen minor geopolitical threats send prices soaring by $10 a barrel in a day. An actual closure would be far, far worse. Prices could jump by $30, $40, or even $50 a barrel in just a few days, pushing Brent well over $115 and WTI, the US benchmark, toward $100. The shockwave has been triggered, and it's now racing toward the rest of the world. Here's a crucial fact about the gas you put in your car. Its price isn't set locally. It's not decided by your state or even by how much oil America produces. It's set on the global market. Even if the United States is a net exporter of petroleum, you're not insulated from a global supply shock. And this is where the next domino falls. With the Strait of Hormuz shut, the world's biggest oil importers in Asia, China, Japan, South Korea, India, are facing a national emergency. Their economies depend on the crude oil that's no longer showing up. They aren't just facing a slowdown, they're looking at a total shutdown of transportation and industry. So they do the only thing they can. They start buying every spare barrel of oil they can find, anywhere in the world, at any price. This kicks off a frantic global bidding war. A shipment of West African crude originally headed for a refinery in Texas is now being courted by buyers in Seoul and Tokyo who are willing to pay a huge premium. A tanker of North Sea oil bound for Europe suddenly gets a much higher offer from a desperate Chinese state-owned energy company. The United States isn't a spectator in this war, it's a participant. Refiners on the U.S. Gulf or West Coasts are now competing directly with the panicked, deep pockets of entire countries. A refinery in Washington state, for instance, now faces a choice: sell its gasoline to local stations at the old price, or sell it on the global market to a buyer in Japan who is willing to pay double. It's simple economics. The oil goes to the highest bidder. That's why even a domestic surplus offers no protection. Your local supply is now on the global auction block. This process is just cold, hard math. Crude oil makes up about half the cost of a gallon of gasoline. So a sustained $10 per barrel increase in crude typically adds 25 to 40 cents at the pump. An initial price spike of $40 per barrel, seen in many crisis simulations, means an immediate jump of over $1.50 per gallon, and that's just the start. The bidding war means the price of crude doesn't just spike and then settle. It keeps climbing as long as the strait is closed, dragging the price of gasoline right along with it. The next domino proves this is way more than just an oil crisis. The modern world isn't just powered by crude oil, it's built from it. Those same tankers stuck in the Gulf are carrying the essential ingredients for almost every other industry. First, let's look beyond oil. Qatar, the world's second largest exporter of liquefied natural gas, LNG, is now cut off from the global market. Europe, having just weaned itself off Russian gas, would be staring down another energy catastrophe. Natural gas prices in Europe and Asia could spike by 40% or more overnight, threatening to shut down everything from home heating to factories. But the ripple effect spreads much further. The Persian Gulf region ships a huge share of the world's petrochemicals, the raw materials for plastics, resins, and synthetic fibers. On top of that, about a third of the global trade in key components for fertilizer, like urea and sulfur, also passes through Hormuz. A closure means farmers in Brazil, India, and even the American Midwest could face skyrocketing costs or outright shortages of the fertilizers they need to grow food. This leads directly to higher food prices for everyone, creating a food crisis on top of the energy crisis. And the shock keeps cascading. The production of semiconductors needs helium, a good chunk of which is caught in this crisis. The manufacturing of countless goods, from car parts to medical supplies, depends on plastics and other oil derivatives that are now stuck in a massive traffic jam. Even air travel gets hit twice. Airlines immediately pass on the huge spike in jet fuel costs through higher fares and new fees. But they also face delays for high-value cargo like microchips, which are often flown through the now restricted airspace over the Gulf. At this point, it's not just a chain reaction, it's a full-blown systemic breakdown. The closure of one 21-mile waterway has sent a shockwave through the energy, farming, manufacturing, and shipping networks of the entire planet. Every product you buy, every service you use is now getting more expensive as these costs are passed down the line, creating a perfect storm for global inflation. It's a cascade that touches everything, showing just how interconnected and fragile our global economy really is. Before we get to the final math and the military options on the table, if you're finding this breakdown useful, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. We unpack the complex forces shaping your world and your wallet every week. Now I want to ask you, do you think the world has become too reliant on a few critical choke points like this? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. So how do we get from all this chaos to a specific number like $10 a gallon? It happens in stages. Think of it as a timeline of dwindling options, where the math gets more brutal at every step. Phase 1, the first 2 weeks. Right after the closure, the world has a small buffer. The United States and other major economies would release oil from their Strategic Petroleum Reserves, SPR. This injection of millions of barrels is designed for exactly this kind of shock, and it works for a little while. It takes the edge off the initial price spike, stopping oil from going completely vertical. In this phase, you'd see gas prices jump to a national average of maybe $5 or $6 a gallon, with prices on the West Coast hitting $7. It's painful, but not a catastrophe. The hope is that the crisis ends quickly. Phase 2, 1 to 2 months. This is where things get really dangerous. The SPR was never meant to replace 20% of the world's daily oil supply for a long time. It's a limited resource. After a few weeks, those reserves start running low. At the same time, the logistical nightmare of rerouting global energy becomes crystal clear. The few bypass pipelines that exist, like Saudi Arabia's East-West pipeline, can only handle a fraction of the volume, maybe around 4.7 million barrels per day combined, compared to the 20 million that are lost. It's like trying to drain a lake with a garden hose. Sailing around Africa isn't an option for Gulf producers either, since they can't get their ships out in the first place. With the buffers gone and no real alternatives, the market enters a new phase of panic. The physical shortage is now real. Oil prices, which were somewhat stabilized by the SPR, break free and surge toward $140 a barrel or higher. At that level, the math at the pump gets ugly. The national average gas price climbs into the $6 to $8 range. The global bidding war goes into overdrive as nations realize this isn't a short-term problem. Phase 3, beyond 2 months. This is the end game. With a full blockade lasting for months, the system breaks. Oil producers inside the Gulf, like Kuwait and Iraq, are forced to shut down their oil fields because they have nowhere to store the oil. And restarting a major oil field isn't like flipping a switch. It can take weeks or even months after the crisis is over. The world is now facing a sustained loss of at least 10 million barrels of crude oil per day, an unprecedented shock. At this point, as one analyst put it, all bets are off. The price of oil is no longer about normal market forces. It's about pure survival. The price has to get high enough to force people to stop driving, airlines to ground planes, and factories to shut down. This is the point where oil prices could blow past 150, 170, or even higher. And the math to $10 gas becomes terrifyingly simple. Start with a pre-crisis baseline of, say, $3.50 a gallon. Add the initial shock from phase one, another $1.50 to $2. Add the sustained premium from phase two, another $2 to $3. And finally, add the pure panic premium from phase three, another $2 or more, as the last available shipments are sold to the highest, most desperate bidder. Suddenly, you're looking at prices well over $9 and pushing past $10, especially in coastal markets that are most exposed to global prices. It's not a wild prediction. It's just the arithmetic of a world that has lost a fifth of its most vital resource. The big question hanging over all of this is, why wouldn't the US and its allies just use their military to force the strait back open? The short answer is they would definitely try. But it's nowhere near as simple or as quick as you might think. An operation to reopen the strait would be a massive military effort. It would mean minesweepers working under constant threat of attack, warships escorting every single tanker, and maybe even a large-scale air campaign against Iranian defenses. It would be costly, slow, and incredibly risky, with the potential to explode into a much larger regional war. Just the uncertainty of a conflict would keep a war premium baked into oil prices for as long as it lasts. This crisis would also create clear winners and losers. Russia, whose oil is already under sanctions, would suddenly find its barrels are worth a lot more on the black market. China could try to use its relationship with Iran to get discounted oil, giving it a strategic edge while everyone else suffers. Meanwhile, America's key allies in the Gulf, the UAE, Kuwait, and Qatar, would see their economies devastated, losing billions of dollars every single day. Financially weak countries that rely heavily on imported energy and food, like Egypt or Pakistan, could face total economic collapse and social unrest. A long closure wouldn't just rearrange energy markets. It could threaten to redraw the geopolitical map of the Middle East. The very foundation of the modern global order, built on the free flow of trade and energy, would be shaken to its core. The domino effect is chillingly clear. A strategic decision by one country to weaponize a 21-mile stretch of water triggers a crisis in global shipping and insurance. That business crisis creates an immediate, violent spike in oil prices. Desperate for energy, the world's major economies get into a global bidding war that pulls prices up for everyone, no matter where they live. As the crisis drags on, emergency reserves run out, and the lack of viable alternatives becomes painfully obvious. The shock then cascades from oil to natural gas, fertilizer, and petrochemicals, crippling global supply chains and kicking off runaway inflation. The road to $10 gas isn't a wild guess. It's a logical, mathematical outcome based on the mechanics of a global system that is deeply interconnected, but also profoundly fragile. The Strait of Hormuz is a stark reminder that our modern way of life and the stability of the entire global economy balances on a knife's edge, dependent on the free movement of resources through a handful of contested waterways. And a breakdown in one can, with mathematical certainty, lead directly back to your wallet. If you want to understand the other economic fault lines that could shake the globe, make sure you're subscribed and check out our video on the vulnerabilities of the global food supply chain. Thanks for watching.